John, this is very cool. We got 21 attendees now. Remember when we planned this and we said, today would only be like a kind of a rehearsal round, because we weren't starting really the marketing fully until, for the coming ones. And so it's so great also that Niko, you could jump on and actually make this a little bit more of like the real thing. Yeah, we basically made our general rehearsal here, John, quite a bit more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, happy to be a guinea pig.
Yeah. Well, we're agile, right? So,
Okay. Well, you want to get started, Patrick?
Yeah, I got my Favreau coffee here, so I'm good.
Very good. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. And as Patrick just said, thanks for attending what we thought was going to be a rehearsal. This is the first time doing this. This is the first webinar in the Favreau Agile Leadership webinar series. And we're focusing on the remote game studio today. It's an area that the company, myself and Patrick have a lot of interest in and also a lot of experience in. So I'm going to start out just doing a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today, the next 45 minutes, now about 42 minutes. We're going to quickly introduce ourselves, the three of us. Then we're going to hear from Patrick. What was the original idea behind Favreau? Patrick's going to have a little bit of a Q&A with our special guest, Niko. Again, thank you, Niko, for joining us. And then I'm going to take over and talk about why everybody's here today, the remote and distributed game studio. What are the benefits? What are the challenges? What are the solutions? I'm going to give you an example of one studio that I'm working with directly now as an Agile coach, Bonfire Studios, that made the move very quickly to remote work when the pandemic hit and the lockdown started. And part of that was thanks to Favreau, not entirely, but part. And then I want to walk you through what we put together, which is this 5-day Favreau Remote Game Studio Quickstart, which is just a way to quickly get up and running for the tool for those of you who are not already customers, or maybe who already are and would just like another transition or a smoother transition to remote work in particular. Then we'll open it up to questions. So now, Patrick and I, this is us. You can see us already, but here's some pictures of us. Patrick, CEO and co-founder, myself of Favreau, and myself, I'm a former Favreau employee. I went solo almost 2 years ago now. And now I'm focused on an Agile coach, and I work under my own Broad Cove Insights consulting firm umbrella. And Patrick, over to you, just a little bit of history and vision about Favreau.
Thanks, John. And I think some of you might recognize me since many years back. I was co-founder and CEO of Handsoft. So we've been in the industry for a very long time, and when it comes to production tools for a very long time. And more recently, I also started an investment company where one of the areas where I invest in is game startups. So basically, pre-seed investments in new studios or game tech companies. And I'm also one of the investors in the fund of Play Ventures, which is a new venture capital company which is exclusively investing in game companies. So some people I also get to know, when they're really just getting started. But my day-to-day job is as co-founder and CEO of Favreau. And I do know that I already saw here in the comments questions about how to actually pronounce it. And in Sweden we have a tendency to we pronounce it very often Favreau. I noticed that many of our American customers pronounce it Favreau. I'm increasingly pronouncing it Favreau as well. And especially now, since many of you like me have probably watched The Mandalorian, and then Jon Favreau has become obviously even more famous because of this, but his family name is spelled different, and there's just a bit of confusion here on the pronunciation. So I'm trying to be consistent saying Favreau, and I'm constantly bouncing back into saying Favreau. So, you know, whatever you feel comfortable with, I'm happy. And, you know, when we started Favreau, it was really based on 3 IDs after having been in the industry for quite a while. The first ID is very simple. It is just about, you know, taking great production management tools to the cloud. So, you know, Hanso was an on-premise tool. We wanted to do something which is cloud-based. And since we have been working for a long time with game developers that are quite strict about security, you know, aerospace companies, defense companies, telecom companies, basically a lot of kind of companies that think a lot about security. We wanted to make a tool that is cloud-based, but also lives up to kind of an enterprise-grade level of security and data locality, which today is quite important with, you know, GDPR and Cloud Act and so forth. So that was the first idea, which is pretty obvious. The second idea we based Favreau on was that we thought there really was a need for a new generation of tool that embraced a more, let's say, organic way of organizing, because we saw that that is simply how high-performing teams are being organized, with, you know, more autonomous teams that are rather aligning towards, you know, the bigger goals than kind of, you know, very command and control kind of structures. So that was the second idea. We wanted to build a tool for that kind of style of management. And the third idea was that we thought, you know, Agile shouldn't just be for dev. It should be for all teams, you know, marketing, studio management, you know, HR, you know, even legal. I mean, we actually have some law firms, you know, using Favreau. So, you know, everyone can be on Favreau, and when you work together, it just helps you also reach your goals together. So these are the, you know, the core ideas behind why we got into this space. And we did this in 2016, and we've been having some fantastic traction. So, you know, that's all because of, you know, you who are clients. And this means that we have got to know some absolutely amazing teams that are very, very innovative, in particular in the game industry. And of course, also we get to know some really brilliant people. And the idea about this webinar series that, you know, John and I will run together is to also have an invited guest for each webinar. And today I'm super happy that we get Niko, because, you know, Niko's not only, I mean, Favreau hasn't been around very long, but if someone is almost like a veteran in Favreau usage, it would actually be Niko, because both at, you know, Riot Games and, you know, that game studio, and, you know, now she got a new very exciting gig. So I'm super happy that you could join us today, Niko. So, you know, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really excited to discuss more about, you know, the applications of Favreau, right? That's how we're supposed to say it.
you can say Favreau, you know,
Yeah.
whatever works. and I mean, just to get started, I mean, I kind of hinted at your amazing career so far, but, you know, if you could just kind of give the, you know, the short kind of summary of, you know, your career story here, because I think it's very relevant to the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I joined the games industry in 2008 in marketing, actually. So marketing, publishing, community management, PR, just a slew of different publishing related roles. And then in 2012, I made the transition into production. This is at Riot Games, where I spent a lot of my formative years. I was on League of Legends champion team, R&D, and creative development. And it was here that I learned a lot about the Agile mindset, and I developed a lot of my thoughts, you know, a lot of my philosophy around production there. In 2019, I left and I joined That Game Company to work on Sky Children of the Light. And just recently I left and I'm on my 4th day at my new studio called Mindshow. It's not games, it's a 3D production animation studio, but it is doing a lot of really cool stuff with technology. And I'm, you know, applying a lot of stuff that I've learned from game development production there.
That is awesome. I've done a few media investments, and there's a lot of amazing people and projects, but it's also a lot of very traditional practices. So it's definitely an industry ripe for disruption. And I'm happy that, you know, you're in the, you know, you're leading the way. If you look back on, your years in production in game development, what would you say have been the changes in terms of challenges, from kind of you started, what was like the big challenges then, and how have you seen that change over time?
Yeah, so I think this challenge is still persistent in the industry, but the idea of transforming your company to from a waterfall methodology to agile, I think it's gotten, I'm going to use air quotes, easier technically, but it's still really challenging. So when I was at Riot, the transformation was happening a little bit before I started in production. And but what I did notice was there was a lot of pain involved, where Scrum was sort of being forced onto teams without really understanding the agile methodology, where it's like, hey, Scrum is a tool, it is not, but using Scrum does not necessarily make you agile. So a lot of teams were being forced into rituals, and it just didn't make sense necessarily for their workflow. And also people were being evaluated on did you implement Scrum versus are you actually getting results for your team and your product? Now I feel like this has gotten better, where at least within Riot, and I think other companies like EA and DICE, where people are walking in, if they say hey, we're going to move towards more agile practices, they are being more cognizant of the team's needs to build, to sort of ease them into a new way of working, and also tweaking it to make sure it makes sense with them. But it was really rough at first, and I feel like it's just it's gotten better. But any transformation, any change that you inject onto a team is going to be difficult to stomach.
I think that's a very interesting point. We definitely see from our point of view also how we have had a transition from, let's say, doing agile to being agile.
Right.
And not caring maybe too much about the exact method you're using or practices. And when you think about it as more being agile, then there's a lot of other things that comes into play as well. I mean, everything from infrastructure to how you do your performance reviews. So
the mindset and the methodology.
Yeah. And if you look forward, then I mean, what do you think? In the future? I mean, if we have this conversation again, in 5 years, what do you think will be the hot topics then?
I mean, I think what we're seeing right now is that there's this huge social reckoning. It's obviously pretty near and dear to America, but it's global, right? Where we're the gaming industry is having a huge wake-up call in terms of sustainability, in terms of sexism, in terms of racism. And so I feel like the challenge right now is there's a lot of companies who are, they're putting out a lot of platitudes where it's like, hey, we're going to change, we want to make it better. But what people are going to want to see is, sure, you're saying it, but what actions are you taking? And are your actions getting results? And that comes with, a process is needed in order to enact those types of changes. And so I think that's what we're going to see. I mean, I hope that's what we're going to see, starting now and for the next few, next years.
That's a great point. It makes me think about a conversation I had very recently in connection with all the demonstrations in the US, where one person not too far from me was kind of he was posing the question of where shall I invest money to support the movement for change. And fortunately, my friend who received this question from this person was very good to say that, well, hold on a second, you actually own a couple of companies that are very significant in this industry. You should not give away money for a movement. You should look at what kind of recruitment practices and other practices you have in your own companies. That is a much more important change. So these kind of changes are maybe everything will just fizzle, or maybe we'll be in a much better place in 5 years. I'm saying much better place because I hope we don't have the alternative of being in a worse place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's important to do both, right? You only can control so much of what your influence is. And, if you're running a company, you have great influence in terms of diversifying your studio, being more inclusive, but if you can also donate to causes, you should, So
yeah, I mean,
everything is needed right now.
That's true. So in terms of, more concretely, challenges that you have tackled over your, last few years career-wise, and you know, of course, I'm quite interested in the application of Favro. You know, can you just share a little bit about, you know, what's been on your, you know, problem tackling backlog, and you know how you've done that?
Yeah, so I mean, I've got a couple of examples, so let me know if I go over. But I started using Favro extensively around 2017 when I joined an R&D project at Riot. This project was in discovery, and it's really hard to track what you're supposed to be doing when you don't, you know, you're trying to establish your direction. And I think, I don't even know if this studio was using any sort of tracking system aside from maybe like a Google Doc or a Google spreadsheet. And so what I did there with Favro is I ran like a Moscow exercise. Now this was physical, like we had Post-it notes, we had a huge whiteboard that like went from the ceiling to the floor, and we did a Moscow exercise. I ported that over into Favro. And then from there, I refined that with the design lead and the product manager to create a clear backlog of work. Because you know, there are so many different ideas that you can pursue, but like what are the ones that are actually going to make a difference, or you know, what are the table stakes? And what we ended up doing there is, you know, the nice thing about Favro is that you can have multiple backlogs, like all present on one collection. Is we had a prioritized backlog, we had an unprioritized backlog for stuff that we knew that we wanted to do, but we weren't sure in terms of where it slotted. We also had a suggestions backlog where anyone from the team could submit new ideas, because when you're in R&D, you're going to have a sense, like, you know, you have to kind of put your foot down and be like, we're going to make this, but you also know that through testing your hypothesis, you're going to realize that like that worked, that didn't, and maybe if we tweaked it, it will, you know, it will actually bear fruit. So the suggestions backlog was really helpful for the team to feel like they could input suggestions, and then in backlog grooming, we decide, you know, does it go in prioritized, does it go in prioritized, or a graveyard backlog. So basically it's just like, hey, you know, there's a lot of ideas, some like whatever, like we don't really care about them, but we do want to keep them available, because what we did notice is that people would bring up the same suggestions over and over again. And we're like, well, why did we say we didn't want to do that? You know, like, and at least you keep that history. Because, you know, if you document that history, people can also say like, well, have you thought about this approach instead? And so you're like, oh, okay, actually this now unlocks this thing that was once in the graveyard, we've like resurrected it, and now it's like somewhere in the prioritized or unprioritized backlogs. So that was really helpful in being able to like estimate our velocity, and sort of like say like, hey, we think we'll deliver a known, like at least a prototype in terms of what we're trying to do, but know that it could slide if new information comes through.
Cool.
Yeah. Another example of this was when I joined TGC. I don't know if people who heard this earlier, but they were asking like, oh, it was like at TGC, and I said it was crazy, because TGC is a very intuitive studio, and process, I think previously, at least when I was like interviewing people when I first joined, was that when process had tried to be put in place, it felt like very restrictive. And so with Favro, like what's really nice about it is it's very intuitive, like anyone can jump in, and the team was already familiar with Trello. Like, I think they had used it for some like personal use. And by introducing that, I was able to set up some templates for one of our evergreen teams. So for those who aren't familiar with Sky Children of Light, get familiar, it's great, play it. But every quarter, the team drops new content, and this is like a ton of content. There's a new level, there are new characters that tell a story about the world, and they each have, you know, some cosmetics, some unlockables attached to them. So it's just a ton of content that gets dropped every 3 months, and it's a lot to manage. And so I created a template to make that more like to be easier to set up. So, you know, once we get done with the season, we can just archive that collection and create a new one. And, you know, that helped. What I realized as I was leaving and trying to get like my backfills ready to take on that responsibility was that I made it a little too complicated. Like the backlog, like there were several backlogs, only I really understood how to use the system. And so I ended up like right before I was leaving, I switched over to the sheet view, which I think, John, you wrote about in your game development blogs for Favro.
Yeah,
and so, yeah, it made it a lot easier to sort of visualize like all the assets that need to be made and, you know, what the status of it is. And also, you know, just update it, we just updated the templates to make that, you know, to sort of like future-proof that, you know, or you can edit and like, resave the templates. So I thought that was super cool.
Particularly good for art assets, yeah.
Yeah, there's just so much, you know, and like you go through different phases. You're like, okay, I need the concept of this asset. I need the block-in of this asset. I need the alpha version of this asset. We need like polish and bug fixes for this. So like imagine following that workflow for, I don't know, like so many cards, I can't even count. It just made it a lot easier to visualize.
Yeah, I mean this this example is such a great illustration of, you know, one of the core ideas we had, you know, with Favro, which is instead of having the same data replicated in different places and in different tools and maybe integrated, instead really thinking about it as having different views on the same data depending on your preference. And, you know, the example you just gave now was that, well, you had one preferred way of looking at it and you realized, well, when I hand this over, it's probably better that they look at it in another way. And, you know, it's really just a switch of view rather than, you know, having to change tools or migrate data or anything. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I really liked is when we were like messing around with the sheet view is that you can also like go back into Kanban view for just like a specific column. And so, you know, even though certain things might be handled in post, you can also like slice your view to look at the things that are in earlier stages of development. The other use, I think, since we're talking about remote game development that I really liked Favro for was meeting facilitation. So the first thing is like stand-ups. Like while I was at TGC, the team there is pretty large. Like, you know, typically, like at least in software development, you talk about having a team that's maybe like 7 to 9 people max. The team that I was on was like 20 plus.
Oh,
and
wow.
So our stand-ups were really long. and this was a pain point for many of the people on the team because you're like, oh, we're talking about relevant information. This is now actually taking 30 minutes. And when we switched our stand-ups to focus on the Favro board, which I've done in physical spaces as well, but you know, it's nice to just screen share and just go through the board where it's like, hey, we're going by task. We know what we're talking about. We're focused on our goals, and we can at least be explicit when we're not talking about the work on the board. Additionally, I implemented retros at TGC, and that was a major challenge for me to figure out what's the best way to facilitate a retro for a team that has not typically done them before, and also again on a large team. And so I created a Kanban board on Favro where I asked very simple ones. Like I know there's another one on Favro where they talk about like they use the boat exercise, like what's slowing us down, what's making us faster. I went with something simpler, which is kind of like what's going well, what needs improvement, and then action items. But I also use like the backlog view to show like what the agenda is, so it's always apparent, to show what the ground rules are, so people know like what's the productive way to engage. And on top of that, what was really nice is, you know, if you've ever done physical retros, I mean, I typically do like the post-it note on the whiteboard and you're sticking stuff up. But, you know, what happens after the retro is done? You take all those post-it notes, maybe you save a couple, you probably throw them away or never look at them again. But the nice thing about the board setup is I created a new board for every retro. So you could go back and you like, oh, this is a retro from this month, this is a retro from the next month. And it was a great way to preserve that history. So we could go back and be like, all right, so we got some action items done. Is there something that's still recurring in these previous ones? So really liked it for that capability. Just made it so much cleaner to read as well, because it's also kind of hard to read people's writing that's not your own.
So before switching over to John, you know, there's one question I of course have to ask you, and I'm obviously extremely, you know, biased in this question, you know,
For sure.
comparing tools. But I mean, you know, you've been exposed to a lot of tools in your career. I mean, it would be cool to just hear from you, kind of a short kind of compare and contrast, you know, between, you know, Favro and the other tools you used. You know, what do you miss, you know, when you're not having Favro?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the other tools that I use extensively is Google Sheets. Like a spreadsheet is just a great place to prototype a workflow, you know, or if you're just doing like a small slice of work, sometimes it's just the easiest for everyone to jam in like one of those files and work stuff out. The thing though is that like you have to do, you know, if you're trying to do something more complicated, now you need to know how to use formulas, you know, how to arrange your views and whatnot. And copy pasting is like really annoying in Google Sheets. rip to physical boards, but those were always fun. If you had the place for them, like the presence of a physical board, I've always really enjoyed. But it's not something that we have the luxury of right now for those of us who are working remotely. Though it is a luxury to work remotely, like it's awesome. As for Jira, that's the other one that I use. I'll be honest, I still haven't found anything better than Jira for bug tracking. Just like being able to get the reports, the burn down reports are really, really useful, like knowing where bugs are coming from, like how to divvy them out. But oh my God, it is horrendous for project tracking. The learning curve is so high. Like, unless you're an engineer, QA, or producer that's taking the time to learn JQL, I have never found another discipline that has been willingly like, yeah, I'm all about Jira. Whereas with Favro, like they kind of just jump in and they figure it out. Additionally, like I've worked with evergreen teams, so like with champion team, you're making new content, but it's still for the most part you're still doing the same kind of stuff. Same thing with seasons for Sky Children of the Light. And there's no easy way to clone multiple cards. So when you're working with these like massive features that have a ton of different assets or tasks, not being able to create templates is such a time sink. It feels like grunt work, and this is not the kind of stuff that I think many of us in this space enjoy doing. We want to use that energy to go solve more challenging problems, not just like data entry.
That's a great example. Jira is probably the most typical legacy tool when it comes to having to interact with other tools from a Favro point of view. So what we did was that we created quite robust integrations with both Jira Cloud and Jira Server. Mm-hmm. And a good practice that I see is that teams, well, firstly having embedded QA in their squads, so they actually try to find and fix the bugs within their iterations. But then they probably have a QA team to capture what I call escaped bugs, and those will typically be in Jira, and there might even be external QA. And then by using the integration with Favro, you can have a backlog in Favro, a list that is automatically being populated in a two-way sync with those bugs, and then you can just click and drag those bugs into your next iteration, or your Kanban board, or whatever way you set things up in Favro. So then you can manage your escape bugs in Favro. It's a two-way sync, so it gets updated on the Jira side, and that is probably the most elegant way I've seen this situation being handled.
Right.
Cool. Niko, thank you so much for joining us. There might be more opportunities to jump into the conversation here later. But I really want to make sure now that we properly hand this over to John, because you got a lot of great material prepared for us.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Niko. With the time remaining, I just want to talk about the kind of core of this webinar, which is we find ourselves all suddenly remote. And I, for one, think that that's a good thing. This is a quote from Jason Fried and David Hansen, the founders of 37 Signals, who are the makers of Basecamp. And this kind of really resonates with me. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the game industry, working in studios, and a lot of those were open plan studios. And open plan studios, open plan offices in general, really have become, as it says here, interruption factories. And one of the big benefits, as these guys call out, and this was a book they wrote back in 2013, they're ahead of their time, is that real work gets done when you're alone, when you don't have distractions, when you don't have interruptions. And with an office being what it is, or especially an open plan office, all of your time is broken up into 15, 20, 30-minute chunks by meetings, colleagues coming up to you, overhearing conversations, whatever the case may be. There's really not a lot of time for focused work. And that's what work from home, that's what remote work really provides. That's the number one benefit in my mind. Another quote that I like, this is also featured in an article that I wrote with Favreau about remote work in general, and also a Favreau investor, Martin Mikos, CEO at HackerOne. So the Industrial Revolution brought us the idea that work is a place different from home and that work is done in physical proximity of many other people. It is the idea of the joint workplace that is the anomaly. Working from home is natural. So if you really think about this, this just builds upon the previous quote. We've thought since the Industrial Revolution, working in factories where you had to work together, you had to be in the same physical space, that's how all work should be done, including knowledge work. But it turns out that knowledge work is much better performed when you do have long periods of focused work time without interruption, which is what remote work provides. So focus directly on how this applies to game studios, both remote game studios and distributed game studios. So there's a difference there. Remote just means everybody's working at home. Distributed means you have people, you have teams that are located in different geographic locations, different time zones, different parts of the world. And so even before the recent pandemic, you had game studios that were working as distributed teams. Another Favreau company, Unknown Worlds, the Subnautica guys, they have been fully distributed and remote since day one. So moving to that wasn't a challenge for them at all. And they've seen lots of benefits, as I think studios will see more and more so as they kind of embrace this remote and distributed way of working. First of all, the obvious ones, right? Lower overhead. Maybe you don't need a physical office anymore. Maybe you don't need a physical studio anymore. And all of the cost that goes along with that, especially if it proves to be more of a distraction than it is a benefit. Another benefit is you can get the best talent, right? You don't have to hire just in LA. You don't have to hire people just in San Francisco or wherever your game studio happens to be located, whether it's in Sweden or it's in the UK. You can hire the best talent, or the talent that best fits your organization, best fits your studio, regardless of geographic location, without people having to relocate, a lot of times having to relocate to very expensive parts of the world. And you're seeing that with other industries as well. Twitter said they're never going back to the office, for example. And Niko, you and Patrick touched on this. I think this is key, right? More diversity. When you're in a certain geographic location, especially Silicon Valley, for example, you're going to have there's definitely a lack of diversity, right? And I think especially since everybody is playing games now, it's appealing to a much broader audience with mobile, certainly. Diversity is key. And when I speak with some of the studios that I've worked with from a coaching standpoint, they say the same thing. They say, we can't just have, no offense to middle-aged white guys like myself, we can't just have middle-aged white guys making games for the rest of the world. You need that input from other people, from other segments of the population. Also, I think, there's a lot of challenges. We're going to get to that in a second with remote work and distributed work. But overall, I think you're going to have happier teams. And I've seen that already with some of the studios that I work with. So, and one of the biggest reasons for the happier teams is, simply no commuting. I mean, especially if you live and work in a very population dense area, you spend a large portion of your life commuting. Here in the US, it's estimated that people who commute to work spend 300 to 400 hours a year simply in their car driving back and forth to work. Imagine getting 300 and 400 hours worth of productive time back into your life per year. It doesn't even have to be productive time. It can be family time. It can be relaxed time. It can be whatever you want, but you get that time back. So less distractions, less commuting, it's going to lead to happier teams. They can, and that leads to increased creativity, productivity, and that's just been proven. So some of the challenges, right? So people worry about a potential loss of studio culture. We're going to address all these challenges on the next slide. But I would beg to differ. I think you can actually take the things that are strong in your studio culture, and those are going to be exacerbated when you move to remote, as well as the things that are weak in your studio culture. Those are just exacerbated by moving to remote, and they're called out much more clearly. If you have a very command and control or kind of micromanagement or hierarchical type culture in your organization, the pain of that, which should have been called out before the move to remote, is definitely going to be called out when you move to remote. You know, this is the number one challenge that people are worried about, right? When everybody moves to a remote way of working. Are people working? You know, how do we know that people are doing their jobs? And there's lots of different ways of handling this. People will come in and they'll say, well, we're going to be tracking their activity online in a worst case scenario. You know, we're going to be tracking their tasks or be even more micromanagement. But, you know, there's a much better way of handling it. And that's just measuring and tracking the flow of value, right? Which we're going to talk about on the next slide. And, you know, it's not about are people busy, are people working? And it shouldn't have been about that before the move to remote. But now certainly it's definitely not about that. Kind of ironically, I'm hearing a lot that there's now more meetings than there were when people were co-located in the same studio. And I think a big part of that is because people are still looking for that connection. They want to collaborate, but the tools and the processes that should have been in place prior to the move to the remote just aren't there yet and need to be there yet, which greatly reduces the number of meetings necessary. And collaboration and innovation. How are we going to collaborate as teams when we don't sit in the same physical space? And is that going to hurt innovation? And it's been proven that remote work done the right way can actually improve collaboration and increase innovation with things like upstream Kanbans. All right, so addressing those challenges. So starting out with culture. If you don't have a culture that's a fit for remote work, which basically means you don't have a culture of trust and accountability, then forget about it. It's not going to work. It's going to be a disaster. You have to have, if you didn't have already, a culture of trust and accountability. You have to believe, you have to trust your people, you have to trust your teams, you have to take the idea of self-managed, self-organizing teams, self-empowered teams, and not just pay lip service to it, but it has to become a reality in the move to remote. Leadership has to be much more available than maybe they even were when teams were co-located, when leadership was sitting in the same physical space with the teams. They have to be available online, they have to be personable, they have to be giving clear intent and direction, and then let the teams figure out how to achieve those goals and achieve that intent. Leadership also has to be very careful about the time that they're not available, because it's a risk when you move to remote of everybody working all of the time. There's not that clear separation between I'm in the office, I'm working, and I'm at home, I'm not working. Now if you're working at home all the time, there has to be that clear separation of work hours and non-work hours. And leadership getting offline, you know, when it's not work hours, agreed upon work hours, is key to establish that healthy balance. In a remote first culture, it's not about showing up anymore. When you were co-located, all sitting in the same studio, showing up meant you were at work. Now there's really no way to show up anymore. So it's really much more focused on adding value. What value am I adding to my team? What value am I adding to the studio? What value am I adding to the game? And that's how you show up. And that's how you should have always showed up, but it may have not been the case. So the next kind of big bullet point here is, once you've established that critical remote first culture, is Agile processes, Agile mindset was just built for this, right? Adaptability, adapting to change. The studios, like Riot Games, for example, which is a big Favro customer. There, I've talked to a couple of people. It was very easy for them to move to remote, and we have a couple of Riot Games guys on the line, I think. Thanks for joining us, and please chime in the comments if you agree. But I've heard from a couple of rioters that it was very easy for them to move to remote for the most part because they were using tools like Slack, they were using tools like Favro, and they also have a very agile mindset from day one. I mean, they're essentially born agile. So having that agile mindset, working in an agile way, made it very easy to adapt to this huge change that has been forced upon pretty much everybody. The first aspect of this is establishing a cadence. You're greatly going to reduce the number of meetings if you just have an established cadence. Maybe we do a daily stand-up, and that should truly be a stand-up, no longer than 15 minutes, right? And then maybe you have your bi-weekly or every 2 weeks iteration planning, an iteration review, and a team retrospective. And if you establish that cadence that happens at the same time across all teams, it's going to create that alignment. And if those meetings live up to their intent, it's actually going to reduce the number of meetings you have to have in between to almost zero. Studio flow and self-managed teams. So studio flow is something I'm going to show you when I walk you through an example of this in Favro. It's how does an art asset, or how does a particular gameplay mechanic feature flow from idea through to actually making it into the game and being released, right? And it's watching that flow as opposed to watching who's underutilized or who's overutilized. It's all about the flow of value, in this case, gameplay mechanics and art assets. And it's that focused on self-managed teams that's going to make that flow happen. Then what do you measure, right? You don't measure activity. You don't measure how are people online, are they working? You don't measure how many tasks they're completing. There's this big concept in Agile metrics of you get what you measure. If you're measuring tasks and how many tasks are completed, you're going to get a lot of tasks completed because people figure out how to game the system, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting anything done. So what you want to be measuring is that flow of value, right, from start to finish. You want to manage in Kanban terms, you want to measure your throughput, your cycle times, and your lead times. And once you're measuring that, you're actually measuring value. You're not measuring tasks, you're measuring how long does it take for a feature to get done? How long does it take for an environment asset to get done? How long does it take for a character asset? And at each stage of that character asset. Those are the things you should be measuring and trying to improve upon. A big part of this, right? Tools have never been more important than they are now. You've got to have tools. Slack, Zoom, super important. The world has moved to Zoom. We're on a Zoom webinar right now, for example. It's excellent for synchronous meetings, whether they're planned Agile ceremonies or if they're ad hoc meetings, and turn those cameras on. Slack, great for asynchronous and somewhat kind of synchronous general discussion, much better than email, but still things tend to get lost in Slack. You spend a lot of time figuring out, well, I know that was somewhere in Slack. I don't know what channel it was in. Maybe it was in a DM. You spend a lot of time trying to find what it was you were looking for. So in that mindset, right, you have to have an online planning and collaboration tool that builds the conversation into the actual work. The conversation is happening where the work is done, which you can do in Favro, whatever you want to call it. You have the full kind of, when you're doing a review, you can reject something, you can approve something, you can have the conversation around that actual art asset or gameplay mechanic feature that you're working on. So now we're already going a little over time. I hope that's okay. I'm going to show you what that would look like in Favro itself. So here I'm just going to give you a simple example in the time that we have of a feature take cover behind objects flowing through from start to finish. So here, this is an example of a Favro collection specifically geared to a feature team. So they have a roadmap for their features that shows one of the different views. This is a Kanban view. Here we have a Sheets view. For an art asset sheet. So say I have this particular feature that we've committed to in this iteration, in this sprint, take cover behind objects. And I want to maybe build out a task list first. What is it going to take to complete this particular feature? Maybe I have some reference. And that's eventually going to start actually working on this as a cross-functional team. Now, you get to the point that this feature is essentially done. You want to move it on to testing, like this, and then you realize, okay, we don't have this take cover behind objects. We don't actually have a block model object in game to test this particular feature. So you'd say, and this makes it very clear, right? You can actually see what other teams are doing, and this is where the collaboration comes in, especially in a remote environment. You can actually see what the art asset team is currently working on. This might be an environment team. So since cards and Favro can live in multiple places, you can see it's also here in the backlog. It tells you that it's in the testing phase. You can move this. You can say, first of all, I'm blocked. Maybe move it to a blocked column where it automatically tags it as blocked and maybe assigns it to the Scrum Master if you're working in a Scrum-based way to remove that block. He could then move it to that, or add it to essentially that art asset team's Kanban. And that calls out to them that they have a blocked item. And you can put some messaging on there basically saying, before you moved it, basically saying, we need block. Something like that. So they know what it is they needed to create. This might become something that's expedited so that because it's blocked, it's blocking feature work. And then they would essentially just move that through their flow. That block model hopefully moves through pretty quickly until it becomes unblocked. And then this could go back to test and work could continue on that particular feature. So the idea in Favro is that each team would have its own collection. Here's an example of the art asset team's collection. They have their art asset backlog. They have their own art asset roadmap. You can drag and drop cards between different views. So you can say this character asset right here, we're expecting this to be delivered within this particular date range. So now this exists in multiple places as well. Just different ways of visualizing, as Patrick said earlier, the same assets, the same features, the same cards. And just to wrap this all up, if you are a producer, and I'm sure we have some producers on this webinar call right now, the producer dashboard is your one-stop shop because you're able to not only have the cards in multiple places in Favro, you're also able to have the same boards and backlogs that the individual teams are looking at on your dashboard collection. So for example, we can see all of the backlogs. We can see the live feature backlog, the art asset backlog or list, what our external teams are working on, what's going on from a live ops perspective, what's going on in QA. We can also see an overall game roadmap, right? We can see the actual live boards in real time, what the feature team is working on. We can see what the art asset team is working on, again, in real time, and chime in, make comments where necessary, whatever the case may be. The idea being that I can work as a producer, executive producer, creative director, development director in a single dashboard collection without having to jump back and forth between different team level collections to see what's going on. Okay, so hopefully that's pretty clear. And I just want to give you a quick example of a studio that I know, another studio that I know because I'm working directly with them, that easily made, or somewhat easily made, the move to remote work. And a lot of that is because they already had tools like Slack, and they also use Favro in place, which greatly helped with their move to remote. They also think in a very agile way to begin with. And I'm not going to play this video. I did a series of, because in the interest of time, but I did a series of interviews with different producers from around mostly the Bay Area and the Seattle and LA areas. And those are all up on favro.com if you want to look at them. Here is one I did with Sigurlina Ingvar's daughter, who is the, she essentially is production or head of production, even though they don't have titles there at Bonfire Studios. And just another customer chiming in on Favro, on Capterra. We needed to manage the workflow of multiple teams working on a single project. And you can see how well received this is, how well received the tool is. If you go to one of these tools like this, there's a lot of positive feedback about how easy it is to work with multiple teams. And myself as an Agile coach, I feel the same way. It's a pleasure to work with Favro, when I go to organizations that are still using Jira, or even other online collaboration tools like Asana. It's somewhat painful to me because you don't have that ability to truly collaborate across teams in a single screen collection. And in my mind, that is just simply key to the power of Favro. Now, for teams that are on the call that aren't already using Favro, we have put together in partnership, myself, Broadcove Insights, and Favro directly, we put together this Quickstart. So for studios that are making the move to remote, or have struggled with making the move to remote, this is a fully managed onboarding of the actual tool, of the actual Favro platform. And here's everything that's included. This is the timeline. We take you through designing the actual what your organization should look like in the tool, setting up all the integrations, your integrations to GitHub, your integrations to Slack, your integrations to Jira if you're using Jira for bug tracking or would like to continue to use Jira for bug tracking, migrating from previous tools, migrating all that data, even if it's just from Google Sheets or Excel spreadsheets. Then there's 2 trainings included. There's 2 certification trainings included, actually. There's the Favro Platform Master, where you learn everything there is to know about administering the tool, setting up the tool, basically becoming that internal champion that can train other teams. There's also a Favro Agile Professional training and certification that's all about just the things we talked about, that merger of process and tools, where it's so important to have that agile way of working to really make this remote first way of working work. Then there's a full communications plan. We have the launch, and then there's some success tracking after the fact to make sure that people are actually using the tool and using the tool Favro the way it was intended. Here in detail is the breakdown of what's included. One of the biggest appeals to this is there's a 25% Favro annual discount when you sign up for this Quick Start. Again, walking through custom design and configuration of your entire organization and setting up your unique workflows. Those integrations, the migration, the 2 trainings, some end user onboarding training for the entire studio, and then the communication plan and the success tracking and metrics. All right, thanks. We did run a little over. We're gonna have to, again, this was a rehearsal. We're gonna have to probably extend this to a full hour. But we would love to take whatever questions you might have.
I did spend some time answering some of the good ones that had come in already in the Q&A. And I would also like to just address 2 good things that you said, John. One was our customer stories. part of Favre.com, where there's interviews with with Lena and others. All of those interviews are a great watch. So go to Favre.com and check out those videos under customer stories. And the other thing is just feel free to follow up with us afterwards. Around anything that was discussed now, around this Quickstart package. With John. Any other questions you have around Favro. And I'm also happy to see that with the questions that came in here in the Q&A, we also have things that are very different. Like, for example, how do you handle emergency procedures? Like fire, earthquake, pandemic, when you're remote. This is a great question. And we got some experience from this because we are working ourselves in a distributed way, and most of our clients are working distributed way. And the short answer is that it's complicated. One of the things we notice is that, for example, when you have employees in many different countries, insurance gets exponentially more difficult. Compliance with laws gets exponentially more difficult. So my best advice to that would be to get like a baseline of good practices that would be applicable in any country, but also make sure that you consult with legal for each country to make sure that you're in compliance with these things, because we have people in Ukraine, and I can tell you that fire procedure compliance is very different between Ukraine and Sweden. So those kind of things you need to look into. Some of the questions, John, I answered in written form, but I see we also have 2 more here. Would you like to jump on them?
Yeah, so is there a way to automatically add a card to one or more other boards when you say you move a card from the backlog into a board column? So this...
Yes.
This is coming from, there is not a way to automatically add a card to another board or backlog, if that's what you're asking. But you do have
you can do it through the API. Favro has the native ability to have cards living in more than one place, as most of you probably know. And you can we're actually done a little bit of this ourselves. You can do a little bit of hacking around this using our API, and you can make that work. Contact our customer success and they can help you. That as a built-in feature is not a bad idea. I haven't seen it on our Canny being suggested and upvoted yet, but
yeah, I haven't seen it.
I see the comment now. Okay, so you move the card from board, you move the card to board A, and it would automatically be added to board B. Yeah, so so that's something that you would have to do through the API, and it's something we're considering, building functionality for. With that said, though, one of the things we kind of learned over the years is that certain things are really good to automate, and some things you should be a little bit careful automating. As I mentioned in the beginning, Favre is very much built on the idea of team autonomy, and studio alignment. And you really want to be careful with that autonomy. You don't want the things that the team has an autonomous responsibility for to start moving around suddenly, because of things. So this is a bit different from the kind of old-fashioned thinking about hard dependencies pushing things around in a big fat Gantt schedule. So when you start putting a little bit too much automation into some of these things, it becomes it's not super, because you want an active decision around certain things.
Yeah, exactly, Patrick.
John, maybe you want to chime in on this.
I totally agree. As much as, especially in a remote environment, there's a dependency upon tools. And I think even more of a dependency, you have to have some sort of a more structured process in place, even though it can be a very lightweight framework. Even though you still have those requirements of process and tools, it's just, as the Agile Manifesto says, right, it's people and interactions over process and tools. And you don't want to over automate things, and you don't want to have too much of a reliance on tools, and that can go very bad. I mean, you definitely still want to have that human factor, but moving, making clear decisions as this actually should move to this other board, or maybe it could be handled by the team where the card actually exists currently, if it's a truly cross-functional team. So it's even though you could do it through the API, I can see why it's not probably built into the tool by design.
Another classic saying there is that most dependencies that are perceived as being end to start are actually end to end. It's worth keeping in mind whenever thinking about those things. I noticed a good question here from Esther, which is would you guys not recommend tracking bugs in Favro? And the short answer is that we absolutely recommend tracking bugs in Favro, both having the kind of QA work embedded within the teamwork, but also if you have let's call it external QA and tracking escape bugs, running that in Favro is fantastic. But we do live in a world where there's always going to be legacy systems. So what we meant by the comments before around Jira is that you might have a team that says we would love to be 100% with Favro, but there's just no way you're going to be able to get there now. So then just firing up that integration is going to be very helpful.
And here's an example on the screen right now of that, showing the backlogs essentially becoming your escape bugs list, but you still have that integration with Jira to keep that synchronization if you need it. But that doesn't mean you couldn't track your bugs only in Favro, right? You could do that. There's nothing stopping you. And the idea, and it's still, again, I think very powerful, because you can have all of your bugs in the same tool where the work is actually getting done. And so you would, in this example, you would even have the ability to say, okay, here's a critical bug. And you can just drag and drop that over to a team's sprint board or iteration board, for example. So hopefully that answers that question.
John, there's one really good question that came up now. So it's like, okay, hi folks, been using Favro at Riot for a good few years now. Absolutely love it. Okay, great. Thumbs up, Rafael. One question though, do you have a good way of assigning weight to cards? It has plenty of different methods for doing this, t-shirt sizes, planning, poker, etc. But I've yet to find something that would work for our team. Is there a good feature for this in Favro? If not, maybe this will become a feature request. So, if I can start, we ourselves use t-shirt sizes, at Favro. So we basically just make a custom column for that, and it has t-shirt sizes, and we apply that. We use t-shirt sizes both for complexity and for value, and in some cases for risk. So that is like the easy way to do it. John, what do you think?
Actually, could I add something to this? Yeah. So I think what Rafael might be brushing up against is Riot uses Enterprise Favro, and there are some permissions that are not enabled on the main account. So being able to create custom fields, I remember I encountered that issue while I was there until we spun off a separate instance for our R&D project. So you may just want to ask whoever is the account holder for Favro to see if they could enable a custom view for your team at the very least. because I used estimation points while I was working in R&D, story points. And yeah, that was a specific request I had to put in.
Yeah, and this is a good good example of something that we kind of came across. It might be that this is actually already addressed feature-wise, because we did get some really good feedback about situations when this was cumbersome to do in a good way, and we did some improvements recently to how this works, and it might be that actually solves it. So I would suggest, as an absolute first step, to just ping our customer success team in the live chat within Favro to see if we have a solution for you, right here, right now, in the way with the latest improvements, or with the improvements that are coming, very soon, because we're doing a lot of things all the time, and if we are in a place where we don't have a great solution for you, that might be a good feature request, or we have a workaround for you. Sorry, John, we interrupted you.
Oh, no, I mean, it's perfect. I'm a big fan of points, and I'm pretty sure at Riot, the default estimation field is points. I could be wrong, but you can create, as Patrick and Niko just said, you can create, if you have the ability, to create a custom field that's any estimation numeric that you like. I mean, the reason why I like points is simply it's still a relative size estimate. It's telling you how, it's how big is this compared, what's the size of the effort relative to all the other features in that backlog, right? But it's something that can aggregate. T-shirt sizes you cannot aggregate, whereas points you can. So you can say, what's the total size of this epic? What's the total relative size of this theme? What's the total relative size of this entire game or this release? And then be able to burn down against that, which is very difficult to do with something like T-shirt sizes or planets or fruits. But that's just my opinion.
John, there's a question from Sebastian here that I think it's a good one for you, around routines, and this is really around a bit of cadence. And you've been doing a bit of writing around this.
It would be interesting to hear if you have any suggestions for you. Oh, yeah, okay, so first of all, and this is, and I'm going to send out to the attendees a couple of articles related to this. One of the things that we have in our remote work, one of the first articles we wrote about this was establishing a studio-wide calendar in Favro, so everybody can see when these ceremonies are, when these meetings are, and if they change. So that's very visible, very transparent to the entire organization. Now, also another good tip around specifically Scrum or based ceremonies is to reuse your sprint boards. And you kind of alluded this to a little bit, Niko, when you talked about retrospectives. So reuse your sprint boards, reuse your retrospective boards simply by saving them as a template. So if you have a sprint board set up with a very kind of detailed, it's almost a Scrumban board with a very detailed flow. You go from test to a test server to finally a review and then a release server, whatever the case may be, and you have lots of workflow rules and restrictions, or maybe even some WIP limits built into that. You don't want to have to recreate that each and every sprint or each and every iteration. So you just simply save that as a template, and then you reuse it for the next one. And then you have that living history of what happened in sprint XYZ, what happened in the sprint, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, 2 months ago. And then you have that same flow, repeatable flow for each subsequent sprint. And you can do the same thing with your retrospectives, which I love that you called that out, Niko.
Awesome. Niko, so great to have you. Awesome that you could join us with a short notice. John, a pleasure as always. This was the first webinar that we did. There's many more to come. Some of them are already published on our website. So you can sign up. You can recommend to colleagues and friends. But there will be more after that as well. So we kind of just got started with this. Thanks to everyone participating. Hope to see you soon in the future. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.